All right, so Ayn Rand. Huh. I bet you've heard the name before. Maybe you even read Atlas Shrugged or The Fountainhead, those massive novels she's famous
Oh,
for.
for sure. Those are classics.
Totally. But here's the thing. They're often seen as more like literature, not straight up philosophy.
Right.
So why doesn't Rand get the same recognition as some of the big name philosophers? That's what we're digging into today. We'll look at why she's not always taken seriously as a philosopher, what her core ideas really are. That's objectivism, by the way, and why she's still such a controversial figure, even, years later.
Yeah, I think the disconnect starts right there, actually.
Mhm.
See, Rand developed this whole philosophical system, like you said, objectivism. But it often doesn't get the same academic respect as, say, Kant or Nietzsche.
Interesting.
And part of that is, well, academics often see her work as not rigorous enough. I mean, there's this whole line of criticism that
Hmm.
says she's more about pushing her own views than really engaging in like deep philosophical debate.
So it's almost like there's this pecking order, right? Some thinkers are seen as more, I don't know, legit than others.
Yeah, exactly. And without that backing from, say, universities and philosophy departments, Rand's ideas haven't been studied or debated as much in those settings.
Makes sense. Okay, let's dig into this ideology label that always seems to get stuck on Rand.
Sure.
Objectivism has some pretty bold principles, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely.
Like the idea of rational self-interest, individualism above all else, and a totally hands-off approach to capitalism. Those aren't exactly subtle ideas.
No, not at all. And that's where things get, well, controversial. Objectivism puts the individual front and center, and that clashes with a lot of modern ideas about, social responsibility or how we deal with inequality.
I see what you mean.
Like think about the gap between rich and poor, or the debates about things like, welfare or universal health care. Those are all areas where Rand's philosophy bumps right up against what a lot of people believe today.
It's like she's suggesting a completely different way to think about, like, what we owe each other.
Right, and that clash is a big part of why she's still such a divisive figure. Depending on, your own values, her ideas might sound either incredibly liberating or kind of scary.
It's funny, though, because Rand's popularity comes from those novels we talked about, and that actually might be part of why she's not taken as seriously as a philosopher. Like, it's this catch-22, she's famous for fiction, but that makes people less likely to give her philosophy the time of day.
You've hit on a crucial point there. There's this unspoken hierarchy in like how we value different kinds of knowledge. Fiction, even if it's thought-provoking, doesn't usually get the same respect as a dense philosophical treatise, even if both are talking about the same things. It's as if telling a story somehow makes it less, I don't know, intellectually serious.
Right. So you're saying that a novel exploring philosophy won't get the same attention as a straight-up academic text.
Exactly. Like, imagine if Atlas Shrugged was just a, I don't know, a dry philosophical essay. Would it be taught in philosophy departments? It makes you think.
It really does. So she's hugely popular, but also kind of shut out of the very field she's trying to influence. It's wild. Makes you wonder if her whole thing about fierce individualism actually backfired on her.
That's a great observation, actually. By stressing the idea of thinking for yourself, she might have accidentally made it harder for groups of intellectuals to get on board with her ideas
Oh, interesting.
because she was very dismissive of, other philosophies and insisted that everyone had to follow objectivism to a T. It created this sort of intellectual bubble.
Yeah, I get it.
And that kept her ideas from mixing with other schools of thought, which happens all the time in academia.
So instead of joining the conversation, she started her own separate one.
Exactly. And that isolation further contributed to her not being part of the mainstream philosophy world.
Think about it. If you're always shooting down other viewpoints and demanding total agreement, it's not exactly the best way to build bridges, is it? Not really, no. It sounds like her personality might have played a role in all of this, too. She had a reputation for being, well, pretty inflexible, right? Like, wouldn't budge an inch on anything.
Oh, definitely. You can have the best ideas in the world, but if you can't, communicate them well or work with others, they might get lost. And Rand's approach, well, it often pushed people away, even those who initially liked her ideas, and sometimes even caused problems within her own movement. Like a classic example is her falling out with Nathaniel Branden, who was one of her closest allies. They had a very public and bitter split, and it just goes to show how her stubbornness could lead to conflict, even among people who were drawn to her thinking.
Wow, so personal stuff really can affect the way ideas spread. So we've got this mix of philosophical ideas, a controversial figure, and a lot of resistance from the academic world. But let's take a step back and think about the historical context for a second. Rand became famous during the Cold War, a time when her strong anti-communist views really struck a chord with people. But have her ideas, held up over time? Are they still relevant today?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
Her ideas were very much a product of her time. Her staunch support for capitalism and individualism made a lot of sense in a world divided by, well, ideology. But as things have changed, economies, and the whole debate about social welfare, some of her philosophy hasn't aged quite as well. Like, how do her ideas about personal responsibility and small government hold up against something like climate change, which demands, global cooperation?
That's such a good point. It's one thing to say every man for himself when one person's actions don't have like worldwide consequences, but it's totally different in a world where we're all dealing with pollution and, resources running out.
Exactly. And that's where a purely individualistic view starts to show its cracks. We're more aware than ever that we're all connected, that what one person does can have ripple effects across the globe.
Hold on, though. Isn't it a bit too easy to just write her whole philosophy off as outdated? It can't just be about, like, greed is good, can it?
You're right. We can't oversimplify things. Rand's work often gets boiled down to these, like, caricatures, like that she's all about selfishness or doesn't care about other people. But her ideas are way more nuanced than that. Take her concept of rational self-interest, for example. It's not about being greedy or exploiting others. It's more about living a life that's true to, well, yourself and going after your own happiness, but not at the cost of hurting others.
So how do we move past those stereotypes and really understand what she was trying to say? How do we separate the caricature from the actual philosophy?
I think it starts by recognizing that even though her work is controversial, she does bring up some important questions. Questions about, like, what's the individual's place in society? What does freedom really mean? How do we find happiness? Even if you don't agree with her answers, there's value in wrestling with her arguments. Like her critique of altruism, the idea that we have to sacrifice for others, it makes you think, do we really have to put everyone else's needs before our own? That's a tough question, and Rand, at the very least, makes us confront it.
So you're not saying we all need to become like card-carrying objectivists, but there's something to be gained from grappling with her ideas, even if it just helps us clarify our own beliefs.
Exactly. When you engage with ideas that challenge you, even ones you might find, kind of off-putting, it helps you grow intellectually. It forces you to think critically, figure out what you really value, and consider different perspectives. And that's a good thing, no matter what.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about why Rand isn't always seen as a real philosopher, the controversial stuff in objectivism, the role her personality played, and how her ideas have been both praised and criticized. But this is just the beginning, folks. There's a whole other side to this story that we need to explore.
And that is. And that is how Rand's ideas, even though they haven't always been, embraced by academics, have kind of seeped into popular culture and still resonate with certain people.
Now, this is where things get really interesting. You wouldn't think her philosophy would have, like, mass appeal, right? It's pretty heavy stuff. So how did she break out of that intellectual bubble and reach a wider audience?
It's a few things, really. I mean, her novels, all that drama and those larger-than-life characters, they make those complex philosophical ideas a bit easier to digest. It's like a gateway into objectivism for folks who might not normally pick up like a straight-up philosophy book.
So it's like she snuck the philosophy in through a good story.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Plus, there's that inherent rebellious streak in objectivism. It challenges the way we usually think and celebrates the individual. That can be really attractive, especially to younger people who are, questioning authority and figuring things out for themselves.
Yeah, I can see that. There's that do your own thing attitude that like speaks to that independent spirit. But it's not just teenagers, right? I mean, Rand's ideas have popped up in some pretty unexpected places, like Silicon Valley.
Oh, absolutely. That whole emphasis on, rational self-interest and striving for excellence, it really clicks with entrepreneurs and tech innovators. They see themselves as, shaking things up, changing the world. And her philosophy kind of justifies that ambition, celebrates those achievements. It fits in with the whole Silicon Valley vibe.
So you're saying there's a bit of Ayn Rand baked into that whole move fast and break things mentality.
It's definitely there. And it's not always a bad thing. Innovation takes guts. But there's a flip side, too. When individual ambition is like the ultimate goal, you can miss those ethical gray areas. You can end up not caring about the consequences of your actions.
Because not all disruption is good disruption. Right. There's a difference between shaking up a system that's broken and disrupting something that's actually, working for people.
Exactly. And that's where you need that careful thinking. You have to be able to look at these ideas critically, not just accept them or reject them outright. It's about finding that balance between like personal drive and thinking about the good of everyone.
So Silicon Valley is one example. Where else do we see Rand's influence popping up?
Well, just look at how we talk about success, about making it. There's a huge emphasis on, you know, individualism, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, that kind of thing. That idea that if you work hard enough, you can achieve anything, that's very Randian.
It's like the American dream, but with an Ayn Rand spin.
Right. And while hard work and all that is important, it's also important to remember that not everyone starts from the same place. There are inequalities built into the system, and sometimes no matter how hard you work, there are these like barriers that make it way harder to reach your goals.
So we're back to that idea that focusing only on the individual has its limits. We have to remember that success isn't always totally within our control.
Exactly. We need to have these more nuanced discussions and challenge those simplistic narratives. We can't ignore the role of luck, privilege, and the way the system is set up. All of that affects people's outcomes.
Okay, so we've talked about tech culture, the American dream. What other areas of our lives have that Rand influence?
Well, think about politics. Her emphasis on small government, individual freedom, and free markets. Those have really resonated with libertarians and conservatives. They see her as like a champion of individual rights, someone who stood up against collectivism.
So she's become a kind of icon for those who want the government to stay out of things.
You could say that, yeah. But while those ideas are definitely important to consider, governing a society, especially a complex one, means finding that balance between individual freedom and the well-being of the whole community, right? It's not a simple thing to do.
Yeah, because if a society focuses only on individual liberty, it risks leaving behind those who need help the most. It's about finding that middle ground where you protect individual rights, but also make sure that everyone benefits.
Exactly. And that takes a really subtle understanding of both individual and collective responsibility, which isn't always something you see in Rand's, black and white way of thinking.
All right, so we've seen how Rand's ideas have made their way into everything from like tech culture and the American dream to how we talk about success and even politics. It's pretty amazing. But we have to remember this is just one like snapshot.
Oh, for sure. And we got to be careful about saying that any one thinker or ideology is responsible for like everything. Culture is complicated and ideas change and mix together in all these unexpected ways. It's rarely just a simple this caused that situation.
So while her ideas have definitely made a splash, we can't say for sure that they're the only reason for all these trends we see.
Right. It's more like a two-way street.
Yeah.
Rand's ideas both shaped and were shaped by the world around her. It's a dynamic process, always changing.
Okay, so we've explored how Rand's ideas have kind of like infiltrated popular culture. But there's one more piece of this puzzle that we need to look at.
And that is the psychological appeal of Rand's philosophy. It's not just about, politics or economics. There's something about objectivism that really speaks to some people on a gut level.
Now we're getting to the good stuff. We've been talking about the intellectual side, the cultural impact, but you're saying there's an emotional connection too. What is it about her ideas that resonates with people so deeply?
Well, think about it this way. Rand's philosophy has this like really clear and empowering message. You control your own destiny, right? You can achieve anything you set your mind to. Create a life of meaning, live by your own values. That's powerful stuff, especially in a world that can feel so chaotic and uncertain.
I can see that. It's like instead of feeling powerless, you can take charge and make your own reality. But isn't that kind of dangerous too? I mean, what about all the things we can't control? The role of, I don't know, luck or just bad things happening.
Yeah, that's a fair point, and it's one of the criticisms of Rand's philosophy. Some people say it's too simplistic, too naive about, how much we can actually control. And you're right, we don't always have total control over our lives. There are things outside of us, systemic issues, bad luck, whatever, that can get in the way and limit our choices.
So it's about finding that middle ground, right? Between believing you can make things happen and accepting that some things are just out of your hands.
Exactly. It's about being empowered, but also realistic, recognizing your own agency, but also accepting those things that you can't change.
Okay, so we've talked about that feeling of empowerment. What other psychological factors are at play here?
I think validation's a big one. Rand's philosophy says it's okay to be ambitious, to strive for greatness, to put your own goals and happiness first. And for people who, feel like they don't fit in or society doesn't appreciate them, that message can be incredibly validating.
It's like she's giving you permission to be yourself, to go after what you want without apologizing.
Right. And that's huge, especially for people who have always been told to, follow the rules or put everyone else first. This message really resonates with those drawn to fields like entrepreneurship, innovation, the arts areas where being unique and expressing yourself is really valued.
I'm curious though, isn't there a risk of like getting a big ego if you constantly hear how amazing you are and how your goals are the most important? Couldn't that lead to some arrogance?
Oh, absolutely. That's one of the common criticisms of Rand and her followers. There can be a tendency to become, well, kind of self-centered and lack empathy for others. It's
Hmm.
important to remember that individualism doesn't have to mean being, heartless or disconnected from your community.
So once again, it's about balance, being an individual, but also recognizing those connections with others, being compassionate.
Right. Understanding that we're all part of something bigger, that how we treat each other matters, and that our well-being is tied to the well-being of those around us.
Okay, so we've got empowerment, validation, and we talked about the potential downside of like egotism. Any other psychological pieces to this puzzle?
Well, there's definitely an element of rebellion. Rand's philosophy throws out, traditional morality, especially ideas like altruism and self-sacrifice. It says it's okay to put yourself first, to question authority, to challenge those conventional ways of thinking. And that can be incredibly appealing to people who feel, trapped by society's expectations or who have that rebellious streak in them.
So it's like she's saying, hey, break the rules, reject the status quo, do your own thing. It's incredibly liberating, especially if you feel like you're being suffocated by, cultural norms or expectations.
Exactly. And that rebellious energy is often what draws people to her work in the first place. They're drawn to those bold ideas, like uncompromising attitude, the willingness to challenge the way everyone else thinks.
But of course, rebellion has to be responsible. It's one thing to question the rules, but it's another to just act recklessly and not care about the consequences.
Oh, definitely. True rebellion. It's not about, just breaking stuff for fun. It's about thinking critically about what you believe in,
Hmm.
what principles guide your actions, and being willing to stand up for those beliefs, even if it means, going against the crowd.
We've explored a lot about why Rand's philosophy resonates with people, that sense of empowerment, the validation, that rebellious spirit. But it's important to remember that this is just like one way of looking at her work, right? There are other perspectives, other
Oh,
interpretations.
for sure. And ultimately, what you get out of Rand's work, whether you agree with it or not, depends on, your own experiences, your values, how you see the world. There's no one right answer, and that's okay. The important thing is to engage with her ideas, to think about them critically, to keep an open mind.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of Ayn Rand, what are some key takeaways for our listeners?
I think the biggest takeaway is that Rand, whether you love her or hate her, was a major force. Her ideas, even if you disagree with them, they've shaped our culture, and people are still debating them today.
And as we've seen, her philosophy has this like multi-level appeal, intellectual, cultural, even emotional. Whether you're drawn to that idea of, taking control of your life or her celebration of ambition or that rebellious spirit, there's no denying that Rand has left a pretty big mark on the world.
If you're interested in Ayn Rand, don't just, take someone else's word for it or go by those little snippets you hear. Dive into her work yourself,
Mhm.
explore those ideas and make up your own mind. You might be surprised by what you find.
And that's what it's all about, right? Engaging with these big ideas, even the ones that make you uncomfortable. It helps you grow, helps you figure out what you really believe. So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those deep dives going.